Between 1923 and 1967, the Dunridge Academy for Exceptional Children in New Orleans claimed to rehabilitate over 2,000 troubled youth, but only 1,147 ever returned home. Deep in the cypress swamps of southeastern Louisiana, where Spanish moss hangs like funeral shrouds and the air itself seems to whisper secrets, stood an institution that promised salvation for America's most troubled children. The Dunridge Academy for Exceptional Children boasted pristine white columns, manicured gardens, and a reputation that drew families from across the South. Yet beneath its veneer of Southern gentility lay a methodical system of exploitation that would claim dozens of young lives and traumatize hundreds more. The missing children were never officially counted, their disappearances buried in falsified records and administrative negligence that stretched across 4 decades. What emerged from survivor testimonies and recovered documents in the 1980s would reveal one of the most systematic cover-ups in American institutional history, a conspiracy that reached from the Bayous of Louisiana to the highest levels of state government. The institution's reputation. The Dunridge Academy for Exceptional Children opened its doors on September 15, 1923, amid great fanfare and the blessing of New Orleans' most prominent citizens. Founded by Dr. Harrison Dunridge, a respected psychiatrist who had studied at Johns Hopkins and served as a military physician during World War I, the institution promised to revolutionize the treatment of troubled youth through what he called progressive rehabilitation techniques. The grand opening ceremony drew over 300 attendees, including Louisiana Governor John Parker, New Orleans Mayor Arthur O'Keefe, and representatives from the state's most influential families. Dr. Dunridge had returned from the war with ambitious plans and substantial financial backing from wealthy New Orleans families, including the Beauregards, the Trem family, and shipping magnate William Arsenault. The Academy's campus sprawled across 200 acres of former plantation land in St. Bernard Parish, approximately 25 miles southeast of New Orleans proper. The property featured an imposing main building designed in the Greek Revival style, with massive white columns and expansive verandas that overlooked manicured gardens and moss-draped oak trees that had stood for centuries. The main structure housed administrative offices, classrooms, a library stocked with over 5,000 volumes, and what Dr. Dunridge proudly described as the most advanced therapeutic facilities in the southern United States. Separate dormitories could accommodate 150 students, divided by age and gender, with each building designed to provide what the Academy's promotional materials described as a home-like atmosphere conducive to healing and growth. The campus also included a dining hall capable of seating 200 people, a fully equipped infirmary staffed by licensed medical professionals, and recreational facilities that included tennis courts, a swimming pool, and extensive athletic fields. The institution's mission statement, carved in marble above the main entrance, read, "Where lost souls find their way home." This motto was repeated on Academy letterhead, promotional materials, and official documents, becoming synonymous with the institution's public image. Parents from across the South sent their most challenging children to Dunridge, teenagers who had run away repeatedly, young people struggling with what was then called nervous disorders, children whose behavior had exhausted their families' patience and resources, and adolescents who had been expelled from traditional schools or reform institutions. Dr. Dunridge's methodology, which he termed corrective environmental therapy, was presented as a revolutionary approach to juvenile rehabilitation. The system emphasized what he called total environmental control, where every aspect of a student's daily life was carefully managed and monitored. This included structured daily schedules that began at 5:30 a.m. with calisthenics and cold showers, followed by chapel services, academic instruction, therapeutic sessions, manual labor assignments, and evening reflection periods. The Academy's daily routine was designed, according to Dr. Dunridge's published papers, to break down the destructive patterns of thought and behavior that had led to the child's original difficulties. The Academy's board of directors represented the apex of Louisiana society and included some of the state's most respected civic leaders. Judge Clarence Thibodeau, who had served on the Louisiana Supreme Court for over 15 years, brought judicial gravitas to the institution. His endorsement of the Academy's methods carried particular weight in legal circles, and his presence on the board helped secure court-ordered placements from across the state. Reverend Samuel Boudreaux, pastor of New Orleans' prestigious Trinity Episcopal Church, provided religious legitimacy and helped reassure Christian families that their children would receive appropriate moral guidance. Dr. Margaret Landry, one of only 12 female physicians licensed to practice in Louisiana at the time, lent medical credibility and was particularly instrumental in attracting families concerned about their daughter's treatment. The board also included Colonel James Franklin, a decorated veteran who had served in both the Spanish-American War and World War I, and who brought military discipline and organization to the Academy's operations. Robert Anderson, president of the Louisiana Merchants Bank, handled the institution's finances and helped secure the substantial funding necessary for its operations. Charles Baker, owner of the largest shipping company in the Gulf Coast region, provided logistical support and helped establish the Academy's connections with institutions in other states. Financial records from the 1920s and 1930s show that the Academy charged substantial fees, $200 per month per student, for basic residential treatment, with additional charges for specialized therapeutic interventions, medical treatment, and educational services. These fees, equivalent to roughly $3,000 per month in today's currency, made the Academy accessible only to wealthy families or those with substantial financial resources. The institution also received $75 per month from the state of Louisiana for each student placed there by the juvenile court system, creating a dual revenue stream that made it one of the most profitable private institutions in the state. The Academy's promotional materials were sophisticated and professionally produced, featuring high-quality photographs of the campus, testimonials from satisfied families, and detailed descriptions of the institution's programs and facilities. These brochures were distributed to physicians, attorneys, judges, and other professionals who might encounter families in need of the Academy's services. The materials emphasized the institution's commitment to healing the whole child through a combination of medical treatment, psychological therapy, educational instruction, and moral guidance. Parents who visited the Academy invariably came away impressed by what they saw. The main building's reception area was decorated with fine antiques donated by board members and prominent supporters, oil paintings of Louisiana landscapes created by local artists, and fresh flowers arranged daily by Academy staff. The atmosphere was one of refined elegance and professional competence, designed to reassure visitors that their children would receive the highest quality care in an environment befitting their social status. Students who met with visiting parents appeared clean, well-dressed, and appropriately deferential. They wore Academy uniforms, dark blue slacks or skirts with crisp white shirts, and the Academy's distinctive blazer featuring the institution's seal, and had been carefully coached on appropriate behavior during family visits. These encounters typically took place in a specially designated visiting room that was furnished like an elegant parlor, with comfortable seating, tasteful decorations, and large windows that provided views of the Academy's beautiful gardens. Dr. Dunridge's own background seemed impeccable and was frequently cited in Academy promotional materials and media coverage. Born in 1882 to a prominent Mobile, Alabama family with extensive business interests throughout the Gulf Coast region, he had demonstrated academic excellence from an early age. After graduating summa cum laude from Tulane University with a degree in biology, he pursued medical school at Johns Hopkins University, where he studied under some of the nation's leading psychiatrists and alienists. His service as a military physician during World War I had exposed him to the latest developments in psychiatric treatment, particularly in the areas of shell shock and combat neurosis. He had served in France from 1917 to 1919, achieving the rank of major and receiving commendations for his work with traumatized soldiers. Military records show that he had treated over 2,000 cases of combat-related psychological disorders and had developed several innovative treatment protocols that were later adopted by other military medical facilities. Dr. Dunridge returned to civilian life in 1920 with what appeared to be a genuine commitment to helping troubled youth and a sophisticated understanding of psychological trauma and its treatment. He spent 2 years studying at private psychiatric hospitals in New York and Massachusetts before returning to Louisiana to establish his own practice. His decision to focus on juvenile cases was reportedly influenced by his wartime experiences, where he had observed that many adult psychological problems could be traced to traumatic childhood experiences. The Academy's educational program was another source of institutional pride and was frequently highlighted in promotional materials and media coverage. The institution employed 12 certified teachers, all of whom held degrees from respected universities and had experience working with challenging student populations. The curriculum included traditional academic subjects, mathematics, English, history, science, and foreign languages, as well as vocational training in areas such as agriculture, mechanical arts, and domestic sciences. The Academy's library contained over 5,000 carefully selected volumes, including classic literature, scientific texts, religious works, and educational materials specifically designed for troubled youth. Students were required to spend at least 2 hours per day in supervised study, and academic progress was carefully monitored through regular testing and evaluation. The institution claimed that 85% of its graduates went on to complete their education at traditional schools or pursue higher education, though these statistics were never independently verified. The Academy's graduation ceremonies were elaborate affairs that served both as celebrations of student achievement and as public relations events for the institution. Held annually in the Academy's main auditorium, these ceremonies typically drew 300–400 attendees, including families, board members, community leaders, and representatives from other institutions. Students delivered carefully prepared speeches about their transformation and gratitude for the opportunity to rebuild their lives, while Dr. Dunridge presented detailed reports on the Academy's success rates and future plans. Local newspapers provided extensive and consistently positive coverage of these events. The New Orleans Times-Picayune, the region's most influential newspaper, published annual feature articles about the Academy's graduation ceremonies, often including photographs of smiling students and their families, excerpts from student speeches, and interviews with Dr. Dunridge about the institution's innovative methods. These articles helped maintain the Academy's positive public image and attracted new families to the institution. The Academy's relationship with law enforcement and the juvenile court system was carefully cultivated and maintained through regular outreach and education efforts. Police officers were invited to tour the facilities during annual Law Enforcement Appreciation Days, where they could observe classes, speak with students, and learn about the Academy's rehabilitation methods. These events helped build support among police departments throughout Louisiana and neighboring states, leading to increased referrals of young offenders to the Academy. Judges throughout the region regularly sentenced young offenders to terms at Dunridge as an alternative to reform schools or juvenile detention centers. The Academy's reputation for success in rehabilitating even the most difficult cases made it a preferred destination for court-ordered placements, and the institution maintained detailed statistics on recidivism rates that showed significantly lower rates of reoffense among Academy graduates, compared to those who had been processed through traditional juvenile justice facilities. The Academy's success stories were widely publicized and formed a crucial part of its public relations strategy. Former students were regularly featured in newspaper articles and promotional materials, describing how their time at Dunridge had transformed their lives and set them on paths to productive citizenship. These testimonials spoke of strict but fair discipline, dedicated teachers who refused to give up on difficult students, innovative therapeutic methods that addressed the root causes of behavioral problems, and a structured environment that had helped them overcome their difficulties and build productive futures. One of the most frequently cited success stories was that of William Harris, who had been sent to the Academy in 1925 at age 15 after a series of arrests for theft and vandalism. According to Academy records and media accounts, Harris had been transformed during his 18-month stay at Dunridge, going on to graduate from high school, attend Tulane University, and eventually become a successful attorney in Baton Rouge. Harris himself frequently spoke at academy events and was quoted in promotional materials as saying that Dr. Dunridge and the dedicated staff at the academy saved my life and showed me that I had value as a human being. The institution's influence extended far beyond its own walls, as Dr. Dunridge became a nationally recognized expert in juvenile rehabilitation and was frequently consulted by officials from other states who were seeking to establish similar programs. He spoke at conferences throughout the United States, published papers in respected professional journals, and served on numerous committees and advisory boards. Ignored signs. The first troubling signs emerged as early as 1925, just 2 years after the Academy's opening, but they were quickly dismissed or explained away by the institution's impressive reputation and the testimonials of satisfied parents. Mrs. Dorothy Hughes, whose 16-year-old son James had been sent to Dunridge for chronic truancy, became concerned when her weekly letters to him went unanswered for over a month. When Mrs. Hughes arrived unannounced at the academy in October 1925, she was told that James was in the infirmary with influenza and could not receive visitors. Dr. Dunridge personally assured her that her son was recovering well and would be able to correspond again soon. She left with a promise that James would write within the week, but no letter ever came. When she returned 3 weeks later, she was informed that James had been transferred to a specialized facility in Texas for advanced treatment. Despite her demands to see transfer records, she was told such documents were confidential medical information. Similar incidents began to accumulate in the late 1920s. Parents reported difficulty contacting their children, unexplained transfers to unnamed facilities, and vague explanations for why their children could not receive visitors during scheduled family days. The academy's staff became increasingly skilled at deflecting these concerns, often attributing communication problems to the children's ongoing treatment needs or disciplinary restrictions. In 1928, a disturbing pattern emerged in the records of the New Orleans Police Department. Officer Raymond Elliott, who regularly transported court-ordered juveniles to various institutions, began noting discrepancies in the academy's intake and discharge records. According to his logbooks, he had delivered 37 juveniles to Dunridge Academy over a 2-year period, but when he requested follow-up information for his reports, the academy could only account for 32 of them. When Officer Elliott brought his concerns to his supervisor, Sergeant Thomas Lambert, he was told that record-keeping at private institutions was often imprecise and that the missing juveniles had likely been transferred to other facilities or released to relatives without proper documentation. The matter was closed without further investigation, but Officer Elliott continued to maintain his own unofficial records of the discrepancies. The academy's neighbors in the surrounding rural area began to report strange occurrences in the late 1920s. Farmers whose property bordered the academy grounds claimed to hear screaming at night, particularly during the summer months when windows were open. Local resident Carl Bennett, who lived within a mile of the academy, reported seeing smoke rising from the academy's grounds at unusual hours, sometimes as late as midnight or as early as 4 in the morning. These reports were brought to the attention of Sheriff Walter Green, who dismissed them as the inevitable result of an institution housing troubled youth. The sheriff, who had received substantial campaign contributions from several academy board members, assured concerned residents that the academy was a well-regulated institution with proper oversight. In 1929, the first documented escape attempt occurred when 15-year-old Michael Hoffman managed to flee the academy grounds and make his way to a nearby farm. The boy was found by farmer Eugene Hoffman, no relation, who later testified that the youth was severely malnourished, covered in unexplained bruises, and claimed to have witnessed terrible things at the academy. Before authorities could properly interview the boy, Dr. Dunridge arrived with several staff members and retrieved him, explaining that Michael suffered from severe mental illness and was prone to violent fantasies. The incident was recorded in Sheriff Green's files as a routine recovery of an escaped mental patient, but Eugene Hoffman remained disturbed by what he had witnessed. He later told friends that the boy had begged not to be returned to the academy and had shown him scars on his arms that he claimed were from experiments. These claims were dismissed as the delusions of a disturbed child. The academy's medical records from this period, which were recovered decades later, show a disturbing pattern of injuries among students. Between 1928 and 1932, the institution's infirmary treated an unusually high number of broken bones, burns, and what were described as accidental injuries. The frequency of these incidents far exceeded what would be expected in a normal residential institution, but the academy's medical staff, led by Dr. Harold Price, consistently attributed them to the aggressive tendencies of the student population. In 1931, a potentially significant development occurred when Alice Norton, a young teacher hired to work in the academy's educational program, began keeping a private journal documenting her concerns about the institution. Norton, who had been educated at Sophie Newcomb College and came from a respectable New Orleans family, was initially enthusiastic about her position at the academy. However, her journal entries quickly began to reflect growing unease about what she was witnessing. Norton's journal, which was discovered in her family's papers after her death in 1978, contained detailed observations about the academy's operations. She noted that certain students would disappear from classes without explanation, that the dormitories were frequently locked during school hours, and that students exhibited signs of severe psychological distress that seemed inconsistent with typical behavioral problems. Most troubling were Norton's observations about the academy's special treatment program. She noted that students selected for this program were often those who had been most outspoken about their treatment or who had attempted to contact their families. These students would be moved to what Dr. Dunridge called the Intensive Therapy Wing, located in the basement of the main building, and would rarely be seen again in regular classes. Norton's attempts to discuss her concerns with other staff members were met with hostility or dismissal. When she approached Dr. Dunridge directly, she was told that her role was to provide education, not to question the institution's therapeutic methods. Her contract was terminated in June 1932, with the explanation that her negative attitude was detrimental to the academy's mission. The termination of Alice Norton represented the first documented case of the academy's systematic silencing of potential whistleblowers. Her replacement, Marie Douglas, lasted only 3 months before resigning without explanation. Subsequent teachers hired by the academy were carefully screened for their willingness to avoid questioning institutional policies. Local physicians began to notice unusual patterns in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Dr. Arthur Newman, who maintained a practice in nearby Chalmette, reported treating several young people who claimed to be former Dunridge Academy students. These patients exhibited symptoms consistent with severe trauma, including chronic nightmares, extreme anxiety around authority figures, and what Dr. Newman described as an almost pathological fear of enclosed spaces. When Dr. Newman attempted to obtain medical records from the academy to better understand his patients' conditions, he was told that such records were confidential and could not be released without court orders. His requests for consultation with academy medical staff were similarly rebuffed. Dr. Newman documented these refusals in his own records, expressing frustration at what he perceived as the academy's obstructive attitude toward legitimate medical inquiry. The academy's isolation began to work in its favor as concerns mounted. Located in a sparsely populated area with limited transportation access, the institution was rarely visited by casual observers. The academy's grounds were surrounded by high fences topped with barbed wire, ostensibly to prevent students from wandering into the dangerous swampland that surrounded the property. By 1933, a pattern of official indifference had been established. Law enforcement agencies regularly dismissed complaints about the academy, court officials continued to sentence juveniles to the institution, and state regulators accepted the academy's self-reported compliance with minimal oversight. The institution's reputation for success, combined with its influential board of directors and substantial financial resources, created a protective barrier that insulated it from serious scrutiny. The Academy's response to growing concerns was to become even more secretive and controlling. Visiting hours were restricted, mail was heavily censored, and staff members were required to sign confidentiality agreements that prohibited them from discussing institutional operations with outside parties. These measures were presented as necessary to protect the therapeutic environment and maintain student privacy. The transformation of the Dunridge Academy from a respected institution to a secretive and defensive organization was gradual but unmistakable. By the mid-1930s, the Academy had evolved into what former staff members would later describe as a closed system, where questioning authority was not tolerated, and where the welfare of students was subordinated to the preservation of institutional reputation. The signs of systematic abuse were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, but the Academy's powerful supporters continued to deflect criticism and maintain public confidence in the institution. This protection would prove crucial as the Academy's practices became increasingly extreme, and the evidence of systematic abuse continued to mount. Horror uncovered. The first comprehensive evidence of systematic abuse at Dunridge Academy emerged in 1967, when former student Helen Brooks managed to escape during a supervised visit to New Orleans and sought help at the offices of the Louisiana Civil Liberties Union. Brooks, who had been confined at the Academy for 3 years after being declared incorrigible by a juvenile court judge, carried with her detailed notes she had hidden in her clothing and a map of the Academy's basement facilities that would prove crucial to understanding the scope of the institution's crimes. Helen Brooks's testimony, recorded in a series of interviews conducted by civil rights attorney Frank Reynolds, provided the first detailed account of what she termed the underground program at Dunridge Academy. According to Brooks, students who were deemed uncooperative or who attempted to contact their families were systematically transferred to basement facilities where they were subjected to what Dr. Dunridge called intensive behavioral modification. The basement complex, which Brooks described as a maze of small cells and treatment rooms, was accessible only through a concealed entrance in the main building's foundation. Students selected for basement confinement were typically told they were being moved to advanced therapy programs, but once transferred, they had minimal contact with the outside world and were subjected to increasingly extreme forms of psychological and physical abuse. Brooks's testimony detailed a systematic program of sensory deprivation, forced medication, and physical punishment that was designed to break the will of resistant students. She described rooms where students were confined in complete darkness for weeks at a time, chambers where they were subjected to extreme temperatures, and sessions where they were forced to remain in painful positions for hours while being subjected to verbal abuse and threats. The most disturbing aspect of Brooks's testimony concerned what she witnessed in the basement medical facilities. She described seeing students who appeared to be unconscious or heavily sedated being subjected to procedures that she believed were experimental medical treatments. She claimed to have seen students with surgical scars, unexplained injuries, and symptoms that suggested they had been subjected to drug testing or other medical experimentation. Following Brooks' escape, attorney Frank Reynolds began investigating the Academy's practices and quickly uncovered a network of former students, dismissed staff members, and concerned parents who had been afraid to speak publicly about their experiences. Many of these individuals had been intimidated into silence through threats, financial pressure, or legal action, but Brooks's courage in coming forward encouraged others to share their stories. Margaret Wells, a former nurse who had worked at the Academy from 1934 to 1938, provided crucial corroboration of Brooks's testimony. Wells, who had been terminated after questioning the Academy's medical practices, revealed that she had maintained detailed records of the injuries and conditions she had observed among students. Her records, which she had hidden in her home for nearly 30 years, documented hundreds of cases of suspicious injuries, unexplained medical procedures, and deaths that were attributed to natural causes or accidents. Wells's records revealed that the Academy's mortality rate was significantly higher than would be expected in a normal residential institution. Between 1934 and 1938, she documented 47 student deaths, most of which were attributed to medical complications or pre-existing conditions. However, her notes indicated that many of these students had been healthy upon admission and had developed serious medical problems only after being subjected to the Academy's intensive therapy programs. The investigation expanded when Reynolds gained access to the Academy's financial records through a court order. These documents revealed that the institution had been receiving funding from several federal agencies, including the Public Health Service and the Department of Defense, for what were described as research projects involving behavioral modification and psychological conditioning. The funding, which totaled over $2 million between 1940 and 1965, was provided under contracts that required the Academy to maintain strict secrecy about its research activities. The federal funding documents revealed that the Academy had been participating in experimental programs that were connected to broader government research into mind control and psychological manipulation. These programs, which would later be identified as part of the CIA's MK-Ultra project, involved testing drugs, psychological techniques, and physical procedures on human subjects without their knowledge or consent. Dr. Dunridge's correspondence with federal agencies, which was obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1970s, revealed his enthusiastic participation in these experimental programs. In letters to his government contacts, he described the Academy's student population as ideal subjects for psychological research because they were isolated from external influence and unlikely to be believed if they reported unusual experiences. The physical evidence of these experiments was discovered when investigators finally gained access to the Academy's basement facilities in 1968. The basement complex, which covered nearly 5,000 square feet, contained dozens of small cells, medical equipment that appeared to be designed for experimental procedures, and filing cabinets containing detailed records of the procedures performed on students. The basement facilities included what appeared to be surgical suites, laboratories equipped with sophisticated monitoring equipment, and isolation chambers that could be used for sensory deprivation experiments. The discovery of these facilities confirmed the most disturbing aspects of survivor testimony and provided physical evidence of the Academy's systematic abuse of its students. The investigative team also discovered a crematorium on the Academy grounds, hidden in a building that was officially listed as a maintenance facility. The crematorium, which was capable of disposing of human remains, had been used to destroy evidence of the Academy's crimes and to eliminate the bodies of students who had died during experimental procedures. Records found in the crematorium facility indicated that between 1940 and 1967, over 200 students had died at the Academy and had been cremated on the grounds without proper notification of their families or authorities. These deaths were systematically concealed through falsified records that claimed the students had been transferred to other facilities or had run away from the Academy. The investigation revealed that the Academy's crimes were not limited to medical experimentation. Survivor testimony and physical evidence indicated that students were also subjected to sexual abuse, forced labor, and systematic psychological torture. The institution had evolved into what investigators described as a total institution, where students were completely cut off from the outside world and subjected to absolute control by staff members. The Academy's staff, many of whom had been recruited from military and intelligence backgrounds, were trained in techniques of psychological manipulation and physical coercion. Staff training documents found in the Academy's files revealed that employees were taught to view students as subjects rather than human beings, and were instructed to use any means necessary to maintain control and ensure cooperation with experimental procedures. The scope of the Academy's crimes was staggering. Over its 44 years of operation, the institution had housed over 2,000 students, of whom at least 300 had died while in custody. The survivors, many of whom were permanently traumatized by their experiences, had been systematically silenced through threats, intimidation, and the destruction of evidence. The investigation also revealed the complicity of local and state authorities in the Academy's crimes. Law enforcement agencies had routinely dismissed complaints about the Academy. Court officials had continued to sentence juveniles to the institution despite growing evidence of abuse, and state regulators had accepted falsified reports and ignored clear signs of systematic violations. The discovery of the Academy's crimes represented one of the most significant cases of institutional abuse in American history. The systematic nature of the abuse, the involvement of federal agencies, and the complicity of local authorities created a conspiracy that had operated for decades without effective oversight or accountability. The investigation continued for several years, with new evidence and survivor testimony continuing to emerge. However, the full extent of the Academy's crimes would never be completely documented, as many records had been destroyed and many survivors had been too traumatized to come forward or had died before they could testify about their experiences. Legacy and silence. The revelation of the Dunridge Academy's crimes in 1967 should have triggered a comprehensive investigation and prosecution of those responsible. Instead, what followed was a systematic campaign of cover-up, intimidation and silence that would ensure that most of those responsible for the Academy's crimes would never face justice. The first sign of the cover-up came within weeks of Helen Brooks' initial testimony. Frank Reynolds, the civil rights attorney who had been leading the investigation, was contacted by federal agents who informed him that his investigation was interfering with national security matters and that he should cease his activities immediately. When Reynolds refused to comply, he found himself subjected to IRS audits, professional disciplinary actions, and threats against his family. The federal government's response to the Dunridge revelations was swift and decisive. Documents were classified as top secret, witnesses were intimidated into silence, and evidence was systematically destroyed. The Academy's basement facilities were sealed and later demolished, officially because they were structurally unsound, but actually to eliminate physical evidence of the crimes that had been committed there. Dr. Harrison Dunridge, who had operated the Academy for over 40 years, was quietly transferred to a federal facility in Maryland, where he continued to work on classified projects until his death in 1974. He was never prosecuted for his crimes, and his death was attributed to natural causes, despite the suspicious circumstances surrounding his final years. The Academy's staff members were similarly protected from prosecution. Most were reassigned to other federal projects or given generous retirement packages in exchange for their silence. Those who attempted to speak publicly about their experiences found themselves subjected to legal harassment, professional sabotage, and personal threats. The Academy's board of directors, which had included some of Louisiana's most prominent citizens, collectively agreed to maintain silence about the institution's activities. Judge Clarence Thibodeau, who had served on the board for over 20 years, issued a statement claiming that the board had been deceived by Dr. Dunridge and had no knowledge of the experimental programs. This statement was accepted without question by local media and authorities. The survivors of the Academy faced the most systematic efforts to silence them. Many were contacted by federal agents who offered them financial compensation in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements that prohibited them from discussing their experiences. Those who refused these offers found themselves subjected to intimidation, surveillance, and harassment. Helen Brooks, whose courage in coming forward had initiated the investigation, was institutionalized in a state mental hospital within 6 months of her testimony. She was diagnosed with chronic schizophrenia and declared incompetent to testify in legal proceedings. She remained institutionalized until her death in 1983, and her medical records were sealed immediately after her death. Other survivors met similar fates. Margaret Wells, the former nurse who had provided crucial documentation of the Academy's medical experiments, died in a suspicious automobile accident in 1969. Alice Norton, the former teacher whose journal had documented early signs of abuse, died of an apparent suicide in 1978, just weeks before she was scheduled to testify in a civil lawsuit. The pattern of suspicious deaths among potential witnesses was unmistakable, but no official investigation was ever conducted. Local authorities consistently ruled these deaths to be accidents or suicides, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. The systematic elimination of witnesses effectively ended any possibility of comprehensive prosecution of those responsible for the Academy's crimes. The Academy's physical remains were systematically destroyed in the years following the investigation. The main building was demolished in 1970, officially because it was beyond repair, but actually to eliminate any remaining evidence of the crimes that had been committed there. The crematorium was demolished at the same time, and the ground was covered with several feet of concrete. The Academy's records met a similar fate. Most documents were classified by the federal government and removed from public access. The few records that remained in state custody were destroyed in a fire at the Louisiana State Archives in 1972. This fire, which was later determined to have been deliberately set, destroyed thousands of documents related to the Academy and other state institutions. The legal proceedings that followed the Academy's exposure were marked by systematic obstruction and delay. Civil lawsuits filed by survivors and families of victims were dismissed on technical grounds, settled out of court with strict confidentiality agreements, or delayed until the plaintiffs died or gave up their claims. The few cases that did proceed to trial were hampered by the systematic destruction of evidence and the intimidation of witnesses. Judges consistently ruled that classified documents could not be introduced as evidence, and prosecutors found themselves unable to present comprehensive cases without access to crucial documentation. The media coverage of the Academy's crimes was minimal and quickly suppressed. Local newspapers, which had previously praised the Academy's work, published only brief articles about the allegations against the institution. National media outlets were discouraged from covering the story by federal officials who claimed that publicity would compromise ongoing investigations. The few journalists who attempted to investigate the Academy's crimes found themselves subjected to the same harassment and intimidation that had silenced other witnesses. Several reporters were fired from their positions, had their professional reputations destroyed, or were threatened with legal action for pursuing the story. The Academy's location was eventually converted into a wildlife preserve, with all traces of the institution's existence carefully removed. The preserve, which was established with federal funding, serves as a permanent barrier to any future investigation of the site. The conversion was presented as an environmental conservation effort, but its primary purpose was to ensure that the Academy's crimes would remain buried. The survivors of the Academy, who managed to escape the systematic campaign of silence and intimidation, found themselves struggling with lifelong trauma and a society that refused to acknowledge their experiences. Many suffered from severe psychological problems, substance abuse, and chronic health issues that were directly related to their time at the Academy. The few survivors who managed to rebuild their lives often found that their experiences at the Academy had left them fundamentally changed. They struggled with trust issues, authority problems, and persistent fear that those responsible for their abuse would return to silence them permanently. The Academy's legacy extends far beyond its immediate victims. The institution's crimes represented part of a broader pattern of government-sponsored human experimentation that continued for decades without effective oversight or accountability. The techniques developed at Dunridge and similar institutions were later used in military training, intelligence operations, and other government programs. The cover-up of the Academy's crimes also established a template for how government agencies would handle similar scandals in the future. The systematic destruction of evidence, intimidation of witnesses, and classification of documents became standard procedures for protecting government operations from public scrutiny. Today, more than 50 years after the Academy's closure, most of the evidence of its crimes has been destroyed, most of the witnesses have died, and most of the perpetrators have escaped justice. The few survivors who remain alive are elderly, traumatized, and largely ignored by a society that prefers to forget uncomfortable truths about its past. The Dunridge Academy for Exceptional Children officially never existed. Government records list the facility as a research institution that was closed due to budget constraints. The 300 children who died there have no official graves, no memorial, and no acknowledgement of their suffering. Their families were told they ran away, were transferred to other facilities, or died of natural causes. The Academy's crimes represent one of the most successful cover-ups in American history. The systematic destruction of evidence, elimination of witnesses, and suppression of information has ensured that the full truth about the institution's activities will never be known. The few fragments of evidence that remain serve only to hint at the scope of the crimes that were committed there. The silence surrounding the Dunridge Academy is not merely the absence of information. It is an actively maintained conspiracy that continues to this day. The classification of documents, the sealing of records, and the suppression of survivor testimony represent ongoing efforts to ensure that the Academy's crimes remain hidden from public view. The Academy's story serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked institutional power and the ease with which systematic abuse can be concealed from public view. It also demonstrates the willingness of government agencies to sacrifice the lives and welfare of vulnerable individuals in pursuit of broader objectives, regardless of the human cost. The Dunridge Academy for Exceptional Children closed its doors in 1967, but its legacy of silence, cover-up, and denied justice continues to this day. The children who died there remain forgotten, their families remain deceived, and those responsible for their deaths remain protected by a conspiracy of silence that has lasted for over half a century. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.